very excited about today, as we have a special edition of #BelongSpace today, because we're going to talk about dismantling systemic racism, but we're going to do it a little bit differently because what we're going to do today is we are actually going to hear from the people who are leading this work here in the Indiana area. And so I'm very excited about being able to join fellow colleagues and have this conversation with others of us who are very much so interested in figuring out how we actually do dismantle systemic racism. So before I go any further, I have to acknowledge the people that are here with us today that have taken time out to share with us their strategies, their thoughts, their ideas, their challenges. I'm going to start with Dr. Karen DACE, who is the Vice Chancellor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Iupui. I'm very excited for you to be here with us today. We also have here with us HOLLI Harrington, who is the Senior Director of Supplier Diversity and Diversity Officer at the Indianapolis International Airport. Now you can see if she waves, you already know that's her though, right? Because it looks like she's in an airport. So you already know that's her. And then we have Charlotte Hawthorne, who's the Director of Global Diversity and Inclusion with Eli Lilly Company. Hello, thank you so much for being here with us today. And then last, but of course not least, Dr. Marsha McGriff, who is the Associate VP for Inclusive Excellence at Ball State University. Thank you also for being here today. I am very excited that you all agreed to be here. You see also our team that has been working to make sure that this is on. Thank you so much, Laura Walden, for being here, Angie, Jolanda, and Ian for being here for LP. If you are here for LP credit with you, Indy, just know that we know that this is a little unconventional because we're doing a webinar today based on the large number of people that signed up for this program. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn the list of names in to the LP coordinator. So it's okay. All right. And then you will be able to join us afterwards for the live Q&A talk back. All right. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in because we don't have a lot of time and time moves really fast in these settings. So let's go ahead and dive in. And I wanted to start with something that it might seem a little rudimentary, but I think it's very, very important that we talk about why we're even here today. We're here because we want to understand, first of all, what is this systemic racism? Like, what does that really even mean? Because we've heard the term a whole lot lately, but I do feel like there is still a disconnect on what it means, like really being able to understand what that looks like. So we're going to take some time with that. And then we're going to explore strategies and solutions that we've been able to see to help dismantle it, things we've been able to use, things we've been encouraged to do. And lastly, we're going to talk about what you can do to help us on this journey. All right. So in an effort to help define this systemic racism, I want to go ahead and share a video. Okay. So this video is one of the easiest. I searched and searched. I'm like, what can we do to really help people understand what systemic racism is? And this was something that I found that I am really excited about because it is a cartoon that makes it very easy to understand what it is that we're talking about when we say this systemic racism. So it's a couple of minutes, but it should help us all at least start this conversation on the same page.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with Black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the Black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow law are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
Wow. So what did y'all think about that? That was was that sorry. Was that a little bit helpful, I think, starting our conversation. But before we dive too deep, I still want to know, like, I think that this helps us ground a little bit, but I wanted to know a little bit more about you as far as your role, what you do, as well as maybe how you have tried to wrap your head around explaining systemic racism. You don't have to go too deep into it, but from your perspective, like, what are you seeing, or how does systemic racism impact your work? So we're going to start with letting us know how long you've been in DEI, what your current role is, and then how is systemic racism, how do you define that in your role, or how is it impacting your role? Dr. DACE, we'll start with you if that's okay.
Sure, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to be here. So I think you asked a couple of things. So I'm the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Iupui. I've been at Iupui for 7 years. I have been in a role doing diversity with a title similar to that for 20 years on 3 different campuses. Yeah, still doing it. I don't know.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So on 3 different campuses, and I think that the video does a pretty good job of describing what systemic racism is. I mean, I think of it as a system of or a network of policies and practices, traditions, and beliefs that have worked successfully to hold back certain groups of people while uplifting others. And I imagine the work that I do tries to combat that, although it's not always at the fore of my thoughts when I'm doing this work, because I think if it was at the forethought, I would maybe be a little discouraged. But we do the work to make sure that those opportunities that aren't always available become available in our efforts to fight racism. So I think I've answered your question.
No, I thought you had a really good, concise, clear answer for the way that you are seeing, the way you define systemic racism. Who wants to follow? Who wants to follow Dr. DACE? I mean, this is a conversation. I would love for this to be more of a conversation. So someone just jump right in who wants to go ahead.
Go. Oh, sorry, Charlotte, go ahead.
Okay, so so Charlotte Hawthorne with Eli Lilly, and I've been at Lilly for my entire career, celebrating 30 years this year.
Congratulations.
And, thank you. Thank you. And I actually came to Lilly in a very different capacity. So I'm actually trained as an engineer. However, during my 30 years at Lilly, I have had what I call 3 tours of duty through formal D&I roles, starting back in the mid-90s when we first established what was then the diversity office, because we weren't talking about equity or inclusion. We were just starting to talk about what is our diversity policy. Mm-hmm. Later on in the early 2000s, I spent 5 years in the office as well. And now I'm actually back in the office for the last 2 years, focused on our both external benchmarking and internal consulting to our business units and functional areas. And, very much like Karen, when I think of a systemic injustice or racial injustice, really those words, I think policies, we certainly are clearer, but I love what Karen said, it's those practices and beliefs that just sort of permeate in an organization where sometimes you don't even recognize that there are differential outcomes. And that's what it really leads to, is differential outcomes. And within our work, probably all of our work, but certainly within Lilly, for a long time, our work has been internally focused, and we haven't called it, I love that we're finally calling things what they are. We mm-hmm. haven't called it systemic injustice. We've looked at the numbers, we know the data was different, and we've worked on fixing the data, but now we're actually moving to fixing the system that's creating the data. And just in the last year, we're actually focusing not only internally, but starting to think about what we need to be doing externally in our community as well.
Right. Thank you so much. That was a really good journey kind of through also going from diversity as far as just numbers being there to how do we actually become inclusive and aim towards inclusive excellence. Thank you so much for that. Dr. McGriff, I think you were about to go ahead.
Oh, it's a pleasure to follow Charlotte. She's quite a beacon for our community. Thank you, Charlotte. I'm MARSHA McGriff, and I serve as the Associate Vice President for Inclusive Excellence at Ball State. I've been in that role for going on 2 years now, but I've worked in diversity, equity, and inclusion, or some iteration of that, for about half of my career. I spent 20 years at IU, let me just say that. 10 of those years was definitely in D&I work, and then I had a stopgap in there where I worked in philanthropy. Worked at the School of Philanthropy at IU as the Director of Admissions and Student Services. So a little different, but it gives you a different vantage point of systemic racism, actually. And so I think Karen and I think Charlotte most definitely gave a great definition. It is just, where race causes a different level of access to goods and services and opportunities. But I also like to expand it to systemic bias. And sometimes that bias it's implicit, and sometimes it's explicit bias, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so bias, I think, is what underscores systemic racism. You know, bias portends that there is an inherent tendency of a process to support particular outcomes, or in this case, norms. And
Mm-hmm.
so my job as associate vice president is to disrupt norms and to teach us to test norms, because norms are that funny thing, right? It's like muscle memory. You know, you do that leg lift enough, it's going to be the way you do it. And then when you see a different way to do it, it gets uncomfortable, right? Because
Yeah.
that's not the proper way to do that particular thing. And so when you're expressing that to the multiple communities or audiences that we work with in our various roles, those conversations can be hard. When you want to look at policies, systems, and infrastructure, procedures, when you look at oh man, all kinds of things. You know, what are those things that are causing, as Charlotte notes, the disparate things in the data? Those data are telling us something. So what is the story there? And how do we get to the bottom of that story? And then have individuals to confront their own biases,
Mm-hmm.
to look at the organizational biases, so that we can all take an anti-racism stance toward how we will be the action orientation in this thing, right?
Yes.
I am the action. I am implicit. I am inclusive excellence. I'm diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not just this office over here of these folks,
Right.
these good people. You all in this audience today are inclusive excellence. It's your job. It's our job to work together to understand and dismantle what we all know now. And we identify, Charlotte, as systemic racism, systemic bias, and so many other things.
Yeah, I like the action orientation. I have the benefit of working with a group of people who are very much so interested in the actions that need to take place, because we have seen this huge delay, and we're going to get into that a little bit more. But I feel like okay, it's easy to just start talking in between. So let me get to HOLLI Harrington, okay? Because you've been so welcoming and such a I mean, obviously I'm new here. Most people know that. So I am meeting people, and you've been such a kind spirit. Could you please share us a little bit more about yourself as well?
Okay, I think it's all been said, but it's our journeys are similar. But I'm HOLLI Harrington. I'm the Senior Director of Supplier Diversity and the Diversity Officer for the Indianapolis Airport. I have been here for 7 years and was hired as Director of Supplier Diversity, and that is one example of something that's come into place because of systemic racism. So I'll give a little slant on that as it relates to business opportunities. But like my colleagues, I was actually mentored by Charlotte Hawthorne. I was at Lilly for 21 years before leaving to come to the airport. And like her, diversity was probably something we tried to hide from. We think you always expect the person of color to be the advocate. And when I say hide, I mean that you didn't want to be the token.
Yes.
You know, you wanted to push the initiative. It was something very important. But I think we were brought up in the school, and you can't fix what you didn't create. Mm-hmm. And so we try to share our experiences and make people aware. Charlotte is from Georgia Tech. I was from Howard. So people's perception of what we were capable of was very different. And I'm also an engineer. I used to always tell them that 1 + 1 is 2 at both our institutions. So if we can establish that as a baseline, because they were unfamiliar, they didn't know. So that is important, because when you talk about systemic racism, it's the tendency to devalue what you don't know. And so if people don't take the time to understand things that they're not familiar with, for whatever reason, it slides to the negative side. And I would say all of us in our roles are here to push it to the positive side. So if you've got bigotry, favoritism, hatred, inequity, and injustice, that's all racism. We're trying to create equity, fairness, impartiality, and tolerance for the things you don't know. So I think that's the role, and just in hearing that, you can see what a big challenge that is. And in the current environment, when you add the things that are happening in the world, most of us are dealing with what I call the split workforce. You've got the essential workers that are on site, and you've got the virtual workers that are at home, and you're trying to get everybody to think about equity, diversity, and inclusion when we're very separated, right now. And then you've got the things happening in the world. You've got the Black Lives Matter movement. You've got the political differences. You've got the racial injustice. And so on top of us trying to move from racism to equity, you've got all these other things. So I would say at best, we're all trying to keep our head above water, and we're trying to create a community within each of our organizations where people can bring their best selves to work. And if you just think about that, whenever you don't feel like you belong, you don't do your best work.
Right.
I mean, I think a lot of people will say, yes, I do, but there's a distraction of, if it's why are they treating me like this, or what did I do? It's distracting you from doing your work. And that's why what we do is so important, because a person can't be their best if they're faced with the product of racism when they come to work every day.
You said a lot. You said a lot in the last statement you made, but one thing that I really, I think is a visual spectrum is this is where we are and this is where we're going. And you explained that this is it's a mountain, and most of you have been in this for years, right? And you said, Charlotte mentored me, now I'm here. You don't want to be seen as a token. We want to be seen as people who are moving something forward. We're taking action. We're not just having the same conversations for 30 years. So I'm going to ask the question that probably a lot of us want to know from your perspective. Is this possible? Is it possible to dismantle systemic racism? When we talk about all the things that we just heard and how entrenched it is in our society and our structures, is it really possible to make it across this, I'm saying bridge that you just described? Like, is it possible to do that?
I'll start since everybody's quiet. And
I expected that you would. I was like, watch her jump in. She had trained everybody. So she's like, let me tell you how we're going to do this. Okay, yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
So I would have to say none of us could keep getting up and coming to work every day if we didn't believe it was possible. If we totally abandoned that it's not possible, we couldn't keep getting up and coming to work. However, we all realize it's a challenge. And it takes a lot. And I know we're going to talk about, what we can do individually, but, it absolutely takes bottom up and top down. So I think what we sort of experienced, even last summer was, we have to kick some buckets and, really sort of shake some realities from the bottom up, so to speak. We have to make some noise that say, no, this is no longer acceptable. And I'm very encouraged by certainly, what I've experienced from our millennials and our Gen Xers, and that, I say probably our generation has enabled them to be able to have the voice that they have and be able to have the courage that they have to really fight and say, no, we're not going to continue like this. My experience, though, has also taught me that it takes some courageous people in power to be willing to, number one, disrupt some things, because the system will not change just with incremental steps. you have to just tear some stuff. You have to tear some stuff apart. Right. And I'll just give a real quick example. We heard from our Black and Latino employees over and over that the performance management system was not working for them. And we'd seen the data, but we gave voice to the data, we gave voice to the employees, and we got the right audiences with the right leaders. And for the first time, I never thought I would see this in my career at Lilly, but our CEO pretty much stepped up and said, throw it out the window and go find me something else. And we threw it out the window with nothing to replace it. Mm-hmm. So it was a strong acknowledgement. You can imagine, despite kicking and screaming from HR, that the system was broken. We don't know why it's broken. We're not going to study why it's broken anymore. We just going to get rid of it and start over. And that took a lot of guts, a lot of courage, and then a bulletproof vest. Because the reality of it is, once you have that courageous leader who starts shaking stuff up, the people who the system has worked for are coming for you. So not only can you step up and then step back. If you step up, you have to kind of stay out there. So I'll yield to my sister to kind of add to that.
I was gonna say I don't want to look at the possibility word. I want to say it is a must.
Okay.
Because the demography of the United States is shifting. And I think it portends that by year 2040, that we will be majority minority. So we must figure this out. Mm-hmm. We must disrupt the systems. We must have a way that we all engage and understand our role as being a part of team disrupt systemic racism, team understanding your own bias, team understanding that we're all on this same team, because we have the future ahead of us that will be very, 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 very diverse, phenotypically, by what you see, by values, by experiences, by religious, and all kinds of different spectrums of diversity. And so I don't see it as as possibility, and I approach the work as we must.
We must. It was interesting. I thought it was interesting when Charlotte was talking about how, sometimes you just have to tear things down. And the reason systemic racism, one reason it's so strong is because it literally is the foundation of the country. Racism is literally the foundation of the country, right? And so it's like, when you think in terms of, the fact is that the system, you are rewarded when you protect the system. And you are putting yourself in jeopardy when you challenge or tear down the system. And when you think about the historical fibers and fabric of our country, and the fact is that we can't go back literally and tear all that apart as easily as maybe we could some of our structures in our institutions and corporations now. So where do we start in this work? And I know that you all have started and are probably starting all the time and starting. So it's like, where do we actually start? How do we do this? Like, if you had to put that into words, where do we begin?
I would say it's awareness, because systemic racism, I think a lot of people have heard the analogy that the young woman during the Black Lives Movement shared about the Monopoly game. And that really resonated for my family, because we played Monopoly when the boys and my daughter were kids, and now we're stuck at home. We needed something to do so we wouldn't kill each other. Mm-hmm. So when they saw her talk about systemic racism is like being on a Monopoly game and you get skipped for multiple turns, and then all of a sudden you're allowed to play. And if everyone knows the object of the game, all the money's gone, all the property's gone, it's pretty frustrating, you know, and that's what it is. So I talked about supplier diversity, and I just want to give another perspective is, if you think about how the business, when businesses of color or small businesses aren't given the opportunity, it impacts our overall economy. And a lot of people don't know that most people are not employed by the big companies. There are more people that are employed by small businesses collectively. And so if you take the pandemic and the impact that it's had, those are the people who are really losing their job. That's the bulk of people. So if we're not doing things to help those businesses be sustainable, the rest of our jobs don't really have the meaning. So a lot of you are in the university, people aren't going to be able to afford to send their kids to school because they don't have jobs. And so it is very cyclical. And, you know, to Marsha's point, it's a must that we figure this out. When I was in college, they were saying 2020 was the year the minorities were going to become the majorities. And just being frank, it's real, because you see how there are two sides to every coin. So we're talking about how we get rid of it, how we move forward. There are people that don't want to see this happen. And I think it is very apparent how they feel about seeing this change. And what I like to tell people to think about is, just because representation, there are more of us, that doesn't connect to the education. More of us are not educated. That doesn't equate to the finances. So while we are more in number, that money shift doesn't go over, that knowledge and education shift doesn't go over. So that's what all of us are trying to change is, yes, we are there in number, but if you think of the world or community as a benefit system, we're trying to shift the benefits over as well. And I think that's the role that we play. And it starts with awareness. First, you've got to let people know that there is this gap, and then figure out how to engage them to make a difference. And then you have to acknowledge that there's some people that don't want to see that happening. And how do you overcome those barriers?
Yeah, I think that sometimes, oh, go ahead, Dr. DACE.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I think I agree with everything that's been stated here. I think when MARSHA says it's not can, but it's a must, or I think it's a must, but that doesn't make it a given. And it's not a given because of what HOLLI has said, right? That, listen, it exists because it works, right? Racism exists because it works. It's doing exactly what it was set up to do. And if we're trying to dismantle it, that resistance is going to rise up too. Sometimes it looks like voter suppression, right? Sometimes it looks like I went to my polling place and it's gone, and I found it and I'm not on the list anymore, right? So you could be in the majority and still be ruled by the minority. So part of the problem is also, sometimes we don't need to know the history, like the example that Charlotte gave. You didn't need to know the history to know that wasn't working. But there are practices that have been embedded in our society that we really do need to know the history. And as one of the more educated countries in the world, it's always amazing to me how poorly educated we are on the history of our own country. And that this stuff didn't just happen last year when a lot of people realized it happened, right? We've been talking about this for about 400 years, and some people have arrived now.
Well, that is also the reflection of systemic racism as well, is the fact that we are poorly educated about the history, not just poorly educated, but flat out lied to about the history of our country. And you see that also, to your point, of this resistance when you have the 1619 project coming, and then you have this whole bills being written now to defund, you know, schools that are going to teach that. And so that in and of itself, the knowledge, the access to knowledge, how are we the most educated, or not most educated, I'm sorry, well-educated country with such a huge deficit in education? It's like, you know, and so I think that that's a really good point. And you talked about the 400 years. I want to share something that many of you will appreciate. And so I know a lot of us can appreciate James Baldwin, right? So yeah, I want to share something that he said.
What is it you want me to reconcile myself to? I was born here almost 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. You always told me it takes time. It's taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my nieces and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress?
I mean, I thought that was very well stated. And I think it really speaks to the frustration that a lot of people feel that are within our work, as well as just people feel. I mean, we've been watching, like you said, and being a part of and being inflicted upon and being all these things for centuries now. And so when we talk about how long is it going to take, that question is interesting that he poses to us. And I'm interested in hearing from you how much was knocked out based on what happened the last year and that impact on your work, and how you've been able to maybe see more or less progress since our incidents from last year. How has last year impacted the answer to this question?
I would share we've taken steps forward and steps back. I mean, I think it's somewhat, obvious, and we've made progress on the awareness front for growth of advocacy. So there are a lot of people who I think are still in shock. And the word I use is what we've experienced our lifetime of people of color in many cases showed up on their street. So they're not just looking at people on TV that are being attacked. It's their neighbor or it's their colleague at work. And I hate to say it, and that took the out of it, that, oh, that doesn't impact me, because I don't, that's not the people I know. They can easily justify and even say it was deserved by those people because they don't know them. Mm-hmm. So I think the world events have made people who are advocates and don't agree with that are kind of in shock and trying to help. And I mean, many of us can share with you the comments on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook that people just want to say, I want you to know I'm not in alignment with this and I care about you. So I think we've made huge progress there. But in the same vein with the insurrection, people who are in not agreement with, we need to do something about it, we need to make progress, have this new confidence. And that's all I can say. So what I say is kind of gone full circle. I remember when growing up, my mother was a Black Pantherish in who she was in inner city Detroit. And, her experience wasn't my experience until it was. So as a young girl, I was like, Mom, you seem kind of radical. It's really not that bad. And, fast forward now, and I'm 50 something, and I'm looking at all of this happening with my kids. And, for those of you that have, young boys or Black boys, we know about the talk and what we have to tell them. And they did the same thing. Oh, Mom, that's your experience, not mine, until it was. And now they're marching with their friends at the Black Lives Matter and very conscious. So I just think, we've taken 2 steps forward, and I must get, or maybe 5, but we have taken a step back in other areas, and we cannot deal with just stepping forward. We have to address the step back at the same time. And that's the challenge. That's the heavy lifting. That's the hard work, because we can't ignore it.
Now, I've just been disappointed with our attention span here in America. Last summer, You know, we were all out protesting, and, you know, there were Black Lives Matter signs up and down the block. And I think, you know, the world's moved on.
Yeah.
And we don't have that luxury to move on because the struggle is still there. So how long until we get to, you know, some level of equity? And I know from a company perspective, I feel like I'm proud of the fact that we're stepping up and we're saying, you know, we're going to donate money. We got volunteer hours. We have an entire racial justice agenda. But it feels to me like going shopping without a list. So we're just doing stuff. It's like, you know, oh, we'll do a little bit of this and a little bit of this. And at the end of the day, you don't have anything that's sustainable as a finished product. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe I've just been in the work for a long time, because, you know, I go back to one of my favorite books that says the older will grow weaker but wiser. So I have less energy for a whole lot of action. And I really want to focus on what are those strategic things that actually move the needle. And right now, Amber, I think we're at a point where activity feels good. We're doing stuff. We formed a committee. We're giving a lot of money to a lot of small nonprofit organizations. And all of those things are good and are necessary, but aren't necessarily the actions that will move the needle. So that's where, you know, I want to continue to focus on. I don't care if we ever have another webinar or another. I want to, you know, like HOLLI, the biggest thing I think we just did was Lilly just launched a venture capital firm to support smaller minority-owned healthcare firms that wouldn't normally get venture capital. Now, that's something that's exciting to me. That's job creation, that's wealth creation, but that's not sexy. And that's not what employees, you know, feel good about. But those are the kinds of things that will start to change. So I think when we really start focusing on what are those real strategic things that move the needle, it's not the sexy stuff, it's the grind stuff that really can make the progress. But I still think we're drawn to the shiny penny, which is the action and the activity.
I so agree with you on that, Charlotte. I'm sorry, Amber.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead. I'm not going to forget. Go ahead.
Well, that's a great point about strategic and being intentional. And what does that look like? And so for my campus, it was really important to, so my job when I got hired, my charge, if you will, was to create the inaugural Inclusive Excellence Plan. So that we can put some meat on the bones around some very specific goals that we had in mind for inclusive excellence on our campus. So it's looking at recruitment, retention, rewards and recognitions, creating a climate and culture of inclusion, training, development, and curriculum, infusing inclusive excellence into that. And then finally, looking at our systems, policies, procedures, and infrastructure. And so every unit and every dean of every college was charged with creating their own inclusive excellence or diversity inclusion plans. And so the way that I think to reimagine the system is to make the mandate, you know, build it into performance evaluations, build it into promotion and tenure, build it into the policy for getting diverse suppliers, you know, that you had to have looked at this many or that many. So you build it into the policies and procedures. And then you acknowledge, you know, that this has happened and make it an expectation that this is what you will do. And to Charlotte's point, from the top, it has to come from the top. And so it makes it either very easy. It's never really easy, but it makes it a lot less hard. How about that? That's a better word. Yes. But set of words, a lot less hard when you have buy-in from the top. But yes, intentionality, I think, is critical to dismantling systemic racism and having each and every member of our community see themselves as a part of this work. not just off to the side, eating popcorn or being what do you call it, a two-finger bandit on some website somewhere, but that they are part of it and build these expectations into the system.
Yeah, I think that I'm glad you actually said a lot of what I was going to say, because I think that there is something very important to talk about, the fact that the inclusive excellence strategy requires exactly what you're saying. And I totally agree that the leadership is key. I mean, we're fortunate. Dr. Manuel is very supportive and wants to see things happen, us make changes in processes and policies and looking at structure and things of that nature. However, it's easy to get tied up in, to Charlotte's point, we had this event, we had this, and those are great, but is it tied to a larger strategy, right? So it's like when to what Holly was talking about earlier, awareness is great, but what is it tied to? So she's saying, yeah, we have to do that awareness, which is where some of these kinds of things come from, but it should be feeding into a greater strategy, which is what you're speaking of right now. And it's interesting when you talk about, because we're doing a similar charge, right? The leaders, we're taking different leaders, making a point of creating a strategy for their area. But it's some of the hardest things to do when it comes to strategy, period. It doesn't even have to be just DEI. Just anything. When you look at your strategic plan, like, it's hard for people to put their heads around measures. Like, how are we going to measure our success? When are we going to look at this and say what's the timeline for completion, right? So when you say we want to improve these policies and you say, but we need it done by January 15th, then that becomes like, oh, okay, because then there's accountability, right? So when we have accountability for the things that are needing to take place to truly refine systemic structures, then we're beginning to see like, okay, I'm gonna put my name down here, so I'm gonna get this done. And when it's not done, you can hold me accountable. When it is done, I can share the credit with everybody that it took to get it done, because it's not just one person doing this kind of work. And so when we think in terms of this, because this was kind of what we were moving to, the advice to people who want to dismantle systemic racism or help with this is exactly what we're talking about. Having specific things that you can do within your power, right? Using your influence to actually turn over some of these systems. And I'm really, like I said, I'm really proud to be working with the people that I'm able to work with across our institution, because I have no staff office. I don't have a huge office. I have 2 people that work with us, but it's like we have a campus of thousands of students. And so that means that people are saying, you know what, I want to do this. And so they're stepping up and saying, I want to be a part of this work. And we're organized to actually make some things happen. So I just think that this is a very good segue into our question regarding what advice do we have for people? And I know this is some of the advice that we have is be strategic, be intentional, set timelines, measures, hold yourself accountable and create accountability structures, put those in place, work with people who are passionate to see this stuff come to fruition. But what other advice might you have for people who are listening right now saying, I really want to do something, I want to be a part of this. What can I do?
I think tied to what a lot of folks have said, everyone here has said, is if you're trying to do this in the workplace, you need to make sure that those in power are on board, or it's not going to move forward. It just is not that. So you need courageous leaders who will stand up and say, we're going to do this because it's important. If not, you're just, I think, going to be tossing and turning at night, right? And really frustrated. So, and I need to sleep when I go to bed. So I would never, and listen, there are lots of folks, and I'm sure we all know them, who have the jobs that we have, who don't have the support that they need. That's and right. Are not able to do the work that needs to be done. That's right. And unfortunately, there are some folks who are okay with that. I don't think anybody on this panel could stay with that. And then I think Charlotte said something that I think is so important, if you want to do this, and understand that it's not going to happen next week or next month or next year. And we are a very impatient culture, and we want it to happen. And I always tell folks, it took us a long time to get here, and you're not going to change it overnight. But our interests, we just hop from one thing to the other. This is the long haul. And if you're committed to this, you need to be committed and surround yourself with folks who are going to be committed for the long haul. I think the reason we have, I'll say, I believe we might be further along if folks had hung in there. All those other times when we thought, oh my goodness, we got to do something about this, and then something else came on, and it's like squirrel.
Well, Dr.
We're gonna call Karen the OG gangster in diversity, because when you watch the movies, they tell you, now after you step across this line, you can't turn back. So that's pretty much what she's telling everybody, that if you step forward in this, there's no turning back. And I think in that, for people that don't have the positions and the titles that we have, you can make a difference, but it starts with you owning your stuff. Be true to yourself. You got to be like, what don't I really understand? What don't I know? What are my biases? And you've got to start talking to people about that, because fundamentally you have to build respect and trust. People aren't going to talk to you if they don't trust you or feel like they're going to be judged.
That's true.
And the only way to get past that is to be open and honest with who you are. And that's the courage part, I think, that everybody's talked about. So you can make a role and start driving conversations and sharing, and then people are going to lean in. And then, it's like those commercials we used to see where everybody's holding hands around the world. You asked, can we do this? One person at a time. Yes, we can. And as long as each one of us plays a role, we're going to make a difference in our community. Because the other part is, if we don't, people are going to, that aren't aligned, are going to find another place to go. But if everywhere they knock on the door, there's a hand being held, they're going to have to start making a difference. And that's what we can do collectively. But if we don't hold hands together, there'll be gaps, and they will find a way. It's like water, the path of least resistance. But we have to be a collective, courageous force that's making an impact. And I love what Charlotte said, not just being busy, but after we do something, pausing and say, what difference did we make? How did we move the needle forward? And if we didn't, we need to be honest about that too, and figure out, okay, now let's take another approach.
Yeah, I really like what Charlotte said about that, just being busy, because, and also what Dr. DACE is saying about essentially fatigue and staying the course. Sometimes we probably are not staying the course because we are so busy, but we're not busying ourselves in a way that actually is strategic and for the long haul. So when you're like looking at something and you're saying that this is a long haul, this is what I'm doing to add to it, you begin to expel your energy in a different kind of way. It gives you that, you see, because you like, I know this part is adding to this part, that it builds into this plan, versus I need a diversity calendar full of stuff, let's put this diversity calendar, get this diversity calendar, and so you're trying to do all the programs for the whole entity, right? Versus let's see what everybody's doing for diversity in their area, and let's put that on the same calendar, and let's like promote that in that way. And but I know that our Vice President of Student Affairs, for example, sent out something, and it had all the stuff from a lot of different areas, including mine, as it related to Black History Month. And that's just one example of how, we can leverage resources, we can partner, we can grow together, but we have to be mindful of that, because that does have something. I mean, Dr. DACE is ready to kick us out, as Holly said. She's like, look, Get out. If you're not gonna stay, bye. You know, so it's like, how do we have that staying power? What do you all do to manage that fatigue, to manage that energy? For everybody out there, we are going to do, I know everybody, the way this works is we talk and then we actually talk. So everybody has a chance to have a roundtable with us. So we will be sending that link. Andrew's going to put that in the chat. We'll be starting that in about 5 to 7 minutes. But I do want to hear about, how do you stay? And how do you manage the fatigue? And you all have been in this work for a long time. How do you do it?
I have one comment. Sorry. It's just that for those out there, just a couple of tips is I think this work, at least for me, it has been deeply a personal journey. And I think DE&I work starts with personal introspection. Notice what you notice, interrogate your beliefs. Who's not at the table? Observe your environment. Are you seeing things that might need to be addressed? And I can warrant that every single one of us in our personal spaces and in our professional spaces, we've seen and observed things. Do we have the courage and the energy to speak up? How do you do that? It's like doing double dutch. When do you get in on that second rope, and when do you start moving your feet? So I think that the work is deeply personal. It starts with you leaning into yourself first and noticing what you notice. And so I think that introspective piece is important. So for me, that is how I keep myself going. I think that this is a calling to help individuals to recognize the sacred story, the power of storytelling, the power of relationships, the power of getting to know people beyond what you see, beyond phenotypical things. There's a big old iceberg illustration, many of you have seen it, that the majority of who people are is below the waterline. Race, gender, ethnicity are things that are easy to identify. But what's the other part of the story with individuals, and how do we develop affinity for individuals? And how is it that we have more in common sometimes than we have differences? If you only utilize a quarter of the humanity of a person, it's easy to marginalize them, to discount them. But once you learn the sacred story, as my Native American colleague calls it here at Ball State, the game changes a little bit. So get to know someone outside of your comfort zone or outside of your affinity group to learn their sacred story. And I think that it's individual moving that forward. And so that's how I renew myself every day, is by doing just that. It's refining me so that I can do this work better for others.
I love that. And
Charlotte, there's something wrong with your audio. I don't know what we noticed it kind of went in and out a little bit. You can try to talk and just let's see if it happens.
Okay, is this any better?
No, but I want you to go ahead and talk. Go ahead. We can hear, I can understand what you're saying. So we want to get that on record. Go ahead.
Okay, so I was saying, I agree with MARSHA. I think all of us turn inward. And one of the things I try to do is stay humble and stay curious. Why am I so certain I'm always right about something? So I think when I stay curious, I'm able to grant other people grace to some extent. And there's an example that I heard one day in a training that challenged those of us who were in the room and who were right-handed. And it was an example of diversity, right? Some of us are right-handed, some of us are left-handed. And the challenge said, when I go through life, do I go through life, I have all the privileges of a right-handed world, and I don't go through trying to oppress left-handed people. I don't wake up in the morning saying, go for me, it's a right-handed world. And I don't even think about the right-handed world that I live in. And that just keeps you humble. And for a child growing up with my children, who that was just their reality, they have to be educated. It has to be brought to their attention. And I have to believe that it's not always ill intent. And if it's not always ill intent, that person, maybe it is, but that's what I need to do to give me the energy to keep pushing forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. And we're getting ready to go ahead and wait a minute. I want to just read some of the things. Angie is going to put the link in the chat for our next space because we'll have a little bit, but she put it in there. But I just want to read this last. Is it possible a deeper issue we are struggling with is systemic issues related to access beyond our social networks and economic factors, where the ultimate winner is those at the top 1% or 10% in the wealth strata? Is it influenced by male versus female issues? The population is aging. How are we addressing ageism and promoting the advantages older people bring to the workplace and our personal lives? We are on the brink of a new era where the minority majority will have larger numbers and can advocate for changes. You did a great job expressing what we could do to promote change for equity for the people that we meet in everyday lives. Thank you. I would like to save the chat. I thought that was very, I just saved it. We'll save the chat and we'll make sure that we get all this out to our panelists as well. But Tamara just left some comments that I thought were really good. And Corey Vitangeli repeated you saying, stand up, be courageous, lean in, stay with it, ask, did we make a difference? And she thanked you for those comments. And so I think that's a great segue into our next space. We'll have 30 minutes where you all will be able to we're going to have an open floor. So everyone that's listening can actually join us and have a conversation if you're interested in just having a talk back. So we'll get to take your questions there and be able to give feedback there. So please feel free to join us. The link is right here. You can literally just click the link that is in the chat and we will all be there and we'll be able to see your bright faces and actually have our conversation. All right. So it's very short, but at least we wanted to make sure that you had a voice. So we're clicking the link now and I'll see you in the next room. Do y'all see the panelists? Do you see the link in the chat? Okay. So just click the link in the chat and then you should be able to join.
Sorry, I had to step away for a second. So did they all jump into the other meeting? Hi, everybody. Everybody who's left on here. So Angie Presnell just put another Zoom link in the chat box, and that's where everybody went for the other discussion. So if you open up at the bottom of your screen, there's a little chat button. And if you open that up, you'll see your chat box. And then you will see another Zoom link that Angie added in there. And you can just click on that and it will take you to the other program. Does that make sense?
You know what? So I was in the other session, but it wouldn't let me show my video.
Okay, so they have to give you rights to share. So I can email, let me text. Yeah, so let me text Angie and tell her that she needs to give you sharing rights.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So yes, everybody who's asking in the chat, yeah, let me see if I can copy her link for you. Hold on one second. Okay, so I just copied a Zoom link in there in the chat for you. Try that one and see if it lets you into the other Zoom. And I see people are leaving now, so that must be working. And then, so Karen, do you see that new link that I just sent?
Yeah, let me do that.
Okay, go ahead and do that. And I'm texting Angie right now and telling her that you need sharing rights.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Oh,